Understanding Islam in 30 minutes. Why does Islam make the whole world tremble? How Islam became a global religion. From the windswept deserts of Arabia to the bustling streets of Jakarta, from the golden minarets of Istanbul to the vibrant mosques of Lagos, Islam has traveled farther, grown deeper, and influenced more lives than its earliest followers could have ever imagined. Today, over 1.9 billion people across every continent identify with this faith, making Islam not only one of the world's largest religions, but also one of its most dynamic forces in shaping civilizations, cultures, and identities. But how did a revelation received by a solitary man in the 7th century, Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, in a small tribal society, expand into a faith that commands such global reach? The story of Islam's rise is not a simple tale of armies and conquests, nor solely of trade and migration. It is, at its heart, a story of ideas, communities, and encounters, of how spiritual teachings resonated with diverse peoples, how social and political structures adapted to new realities, and how human interactions carried the message across oceans, mountains, and empires. This journey is not just historical, it is profoundly human. The expansion of Islam intertwines with art, science, politics, and the struggle for meaning in a complex world. It is a narrative of unity and diversity, conflict and cooperation, rooted in both faith and the daily lives of those who carried it forward. The story of Islam's beginnings cannot be separated from the social, political and cultural environment of the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era. For it was within this specific world that the revelation to Muhammad occurred, and within which the earliest community of Muslims took shape, crystallizing the core beliefs and practices that would define the religion for centuries to come. And in order to appreciate the significance of this transformation, it is necessary first to understand the conditions of pre-Islamic Arabia, often referred to by Muslim historians as the age of Jahiliyyah, or ignorance, though this label should not be taken to mean an absence of culture or morality, but rather a state of spiritual disorientation in comparison to the order that Islam would bring, for in reality the Arabian Peninsula was a mosaic of tribal loyalties, economic exchanges, and religious ideas that created both the challenges and opportunities into which the new message entered, and at the heart of this world lay the centrality of the tribe as the fundamental unit of social organization, binding individuals through kinship ties and collective honor in a harsh, desert environment where survival depended on solidarity and reputation. In this tribal order, political authority was decentralized, with leadership exercised through chiefs whose power rested not on absolute coercion, but on consensus, persuasion, and the ability to defend the group's interests, while intertribal rivalries often led to cycles of raiding and warfare. And within this environment, values such as bravery, generosity, loyalty, and hospitality were celebrated in the oral poetry that preserved collective memory, serving as both entertainment and a vehicle of moral instruction. Yet the same system also entrenched deep inequalities, particularly in the treatment of weaker clans, slaves, and women, and fostered instability through its constant feuds. Economically, the Arabian Peninsula was far from isolated, for while much of it consisted of arid desert, caravan trade routes linked the south with Yemen and its frankincense trade, the north with Syria and the Byzantine world, and the east with Persia, while towns such as Mecca and Yathrib, later renamed Medina, served as key hubs where merchants, pilgrims, and travelers converged, and Mecca in particular occupied a special status not only as a commercial center, but also as the site of the Kaaba, a shrine that housed numerous idols worshipped by various tribes, making it a religious as well as economic focal point, which meant that the Quraysh, the dominant tribe in Mecca, enjoyed considerable prestige and prosperity as custodians of this sanctuary. Religiously, the landscape of Arabia was pluralistic and fluid, For while polytheism was widespread and the Kaaba enshrined images of multiple deities associated with tribes and natural forces, there were also pockets of monotheism influenced by the Jews of Yathrib and Khaybar, the Christians of Najran and the northern borderlands, and scattered groups of so-called Hanifs, Arab seekers dissatisfied with idolatry who inclined toward a pure worship of one God, often recalling the legacy of Abraham, whom Arabs regarded as their ancestor through his son Ishmael. And this diversity meant that the concept of one supreme God was not entirely foreign to the people of Arabia, even if it was not dominant. So when Muhammad began to preach the oneness of God, he was articulating an idea that some could recognize, but which challenged the entrenched interests of Meccan society and its polytheistic traditions. Into this environment, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born around 570 CE, a year remembered in Arab tradition as the Year of the Elephant because of an unsuccessful military campaign against Mecca led by the Abyssinian governor Abraha, who had marched with elephants intending to destroy the Kaaba but was thwarted, an event interpreted as a sign of divine protection for the sanctuary, and Muhammad was born into the Hashim clan of the Quraysh tribe, a respected but not the wealthiest branch, and he was orphaned at a young age, losing his father before birth and his mother by the age of 6, after which he came under the care of his grandfather Abd al-Muttalib and then his uncle Abu Talib. And though his material circumstances were modest, he grew up within the wider protection of his kin and earned a reputation for honesty and reliability, acquiring the nickname Al-Amin, the trustworthy, during his youth and early adulthood. As a young man, Muhammad worked as a merchant and caravan agent, traveling on trade routes that exposed him to diverse cultures and ideas, and it was through his integrity in business dealings that he came to the attention of a wealthy merchant widow, Khadijah, who employed him to manage her caravans and later married him when he was about 25 and she 40, and their marriage was one of companionship and support, producing children and providing Muhammad with stability, while Khadijah would later become his first and most steadfast supporter when his prophetic mission began. Around the age of 40, Muhammad began to experience spiritual restlessness, often retreating to the cave of Hira on a mountain outside Mecca for meditation and reflection, and it was during one of these retreats, in the year 610, that he received his first revelation, an overwhelming encounter with the angel Jibril, or Gabriel, who commanded him to recite, initiating the process by which the Quran, the holy scripture of Islam, was gradually revealed over the next 23 years, and Muhammad returned from this experience shaken, confiding in Khadijah, who comforted him and affirmed his calling, and together with her and a small circle of relatives and friends, including his cousin Ali, his servant Zayd, and his close companion Abu Bakr, the first Muslim community began to form. The early message of Islam was simple yet radical, that there is no God but God, Allah, that Muhammad is his messenger, and that people are called to abandon idolatry, recognize the day of judgment, and live ethically through prayer, charity, and justice. And this message carried profound spiritual and social implications, for in a society structured by tribal privilege and economic inequities, it asserted the equality of all believers before God, condemned exploitation of the poor and vulnerable, and demanded accountability to a higher moral order. And while some were drawn to this teaching, especially those marginalized in Meccan society, many among the Quraysh elite saw it as a threat to their religious authority, economic interests, and traditions, so opposition quickly mounted. The period of Meccan preaching lasted 13 years, during which Muhammad and his followers endured ridicule, persecution, and social boycotts, yet the revelations continued to guide them, gradually outlining the core beliefs and practices of Islam, including regular prayer directed toward God, fasting, almsgiving, and ethical injunctions against injustice, dishonesty, and immorality, while stories of earlier prophets, such as Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, affirmed that Muhammad's mission was part of a larger monotheistic tradition, presenting Islam not as a new invention, but as a restoration of the primordial faith of submission to the one God, which had been obscured over time. The turning point came with the invitation from tribes in Yathrib, a town riven by intertribal conflicts between its Arab clans, Aws and Khazraj, and its significant Jewish community, who sought a neutral leader to arbitrate their disputes, and after pledging allegiance to Muhammad and inviting him and his followers to migrate, the Hijra, or emigration, occurred in 622, marking the beginning of the Islamic calendar. And in Medina, Muhammad assumed not only the role of spiritual guide, but also political leader, establishing the Constitution of Medina, a document that defined relations among Muslims, Jews, and other groups, laying down principles of mutual defense, religious freedom, and collective responsibility under a single community, or ummah, transcending tribal divisions. In Medina, the Muslim community gained greater cohesion and institutional shape, with prayer organized in congregation, the mosque serving as both a religious and social center, and practices such as fasting in Ramadan and the giving of zakat, alms, becoming regularized, while military confrontations with the Quraysh of Mecca, including the battles of Badr, Uhud, and the Trench, tested the resilience of the believers and reinforced the conviction that their struggle was divinely guided. And revelations during this period provided detailed guidance on matters of law, family, commerce, and warfare, embedding Islam not only as a personal faith, but as a comprehensive framework for communal life. Gradually, Muhammad's influence expanded as alliances were forged with tribes across Arabia, and by the time of the peaceful conquest of Mecca in 630, when Muhammad and his followers entered the city with little bloodshed and cleansed the Kaaba of its idols, Islam had established itself as the dominant faith of the Arabian Peninsula, its message of monotheism triumphing over the old order of tribal polytheism. Yet Muhammad emphasized forgiveness and reconciliation, declaring amnesty for many of his former opponents, thereby consolidating unity rather than perpetuating vengeance. And within 2 years, by the time of his death in 632, most of Arabia had embraced Islam, leaving to his companions the task of preserving and carrying forward the faith beyond its birthplace. What crystallized during these formative years under Muhammad and his companions were the foundational elements of Islam, the belief in the oneness of God, and Muhammad's role as his final messenger, the recognition of previous prophets and scriptures, the centrality of the Quran as divine revelation, and the establishment of core practices later codified as the 5 pillars: profession of faith, shahada, prayer, salat, almsgiving, zakat, fasting in Ramadan, Psalm, and pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj, which together created a shared religious identity that transcended tribe and ethnicity. And in this synthesis of belief, ritual, and community lay the enduring strength of Islam, enabling it not only to root itself in Arabia, but also to carry the seeds of global expansion that would unfold in the centuries to come. With the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, the nascent Muslim community faced the urgent question of leadership and direction. For while the Prophet had left behind a unified ummah bound by faith and practice, he had not specified in precise institutional terms how authority was to be passed on, and thus the companions gathered and selected Abu Bakr, a close friend of Muhammad and the first adult male convert to Islam, as the caliph or successor, inaugurating the Rashidun Caliphate, the rightly guided leadership that would extend over the next 3 decades and lay the foundations for the astonishing expansion of Islam beyond the Arabian Peninsula. And under Abu Bakr, the immediate challenge was the Ridda Wars, or Wars of Apostasy, in which various tribes that had submitted to Muhammad sought to break away after his death, refusing to pay the zakat or reverting to their older practices. and Abu Bakr, determined that the unity of the Ummah must not dissolve, launched a series of campaigns to bring them back into the fold, not only preserving the integrity of the community, but also strengthening its cohesion for further outward expansion. Once internal unity was secured, the energy of the Muslims turned outward, and under the leadership of Abu Bakr and his successor, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the armies of Islam moved with remarkable speed into the neighboring Byzantine and Sasanian empires, two long-established powers that had been locked in exhausting wars with one another and whose populations were often weary of heavy taxation, sectarian disputes, and political instability, conditions that created fertile ground for the relatively small but determined Muslim forces to achieve victories disproportionate to their size. In the 630s, Muslim forces under commanders such as Khalid ibn al-Walid engaged Byzantine armies in Syria and Palestine, culminating in the decisive Battle of Yarmouk in 636, where, despite being vastly outnumbered, the Muslims inflicted a crushing defeat on the Byzantines, leading to the rapid fall of Damascus, Jerusalem, and other major cities, while simultaneously campaigns into Iraq brought about the defeat of the Sasanian forces at the Battle of al-Qadisiyah, also in 636, and the subsequent capture of the Persian capital Ctesiphon, setting in motion the unraveling of the Sasanian Empire. Umar, who succeeded Abu Bakr in 634, presided over this extraordinary wave of conquests, and his leadership was characterized by both austerity and administrative foresight, for he not only directed military campaigns but also established systems of governance for the newly acquired territories, creating registers for stipends to soldiers, organizing taxation in a manner that preserved the productivity of conquered lands, and ensuring that the conquered populations, many of whom were Christians, Jews, or adherents of other faiths, were recognized as dhimmis, protected peoples, allowed to practice their religions in exchange for the payment of a poll tax known as jizya, while Muslims paid zakat, thus institutionalizing a framework that allowed for coexistence while maintaining the primacy of the Muslim community. The policy was pragmatic, for by avoiding forced conversions and respecting existing communities, the caliphate could stabilize new regions and benefit from their agricultural and economic contributions without provoking rebellion, and this approach helped explain how, relatively small, Muslim armies were able to hold vast territories. During Umar's decade of rule, the Muslim state expanded across Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and into Persia, while also establishing garrison cities such as Kufa, Basra, and Fustat, which served both as military bases and administrative centers, housing Arab settlers separately from the indigenous populations so as to preserve their cohesion while gradually facilitating cultural and economic interaction. And these garrisons became focal points of Islamic civilization, anchoring the faith in lands far removed from Arabia. After Umar's assassination in 644, he was succeeded by Uthman ibn Affan, whose reign saw the continuation of expansion further into North Africa and deeper into Persia, while also undertaking the crucial project of compiling the Quran into a standardized text, for as the empire expanded and Islam spread among diverse peoples, variations in recitation threatened unity, and under Uthman the official recension was produced and distributed to key cities, cementing the uniformity of scripture that remains to this day. Yet Uthman's rule also witnessed growing internal dissent, as accusations of nepotism and mismanagement arose, culminating in his assassination in 656, which plunged the community into its first civil war, the Fitna, and his successor, Ali ibn Abi Talib, faced rebellions including that of Muawiyah, governor of Syria, leading to divisions that eventually crystallized into the Sunni-Shia split, a religious and political fracture with enduring consequences for Islamic history. Despite the turbulence of internal conflicts, the momentum of expansion did not cease, for even as Ali struggled to assert authority, Muslim forces pressed further east into Central Asia and west into North Africa, and by the time of his death in 661 the foundations had been laid for a vast empire that would soon consolidate under the Umayyad dynasty. But the Rashidun period remained the template for just rule in Islamic memory, exemplifying simplicity, devotion, and rapid growth under leaders who were both companions of the Prophet and stewards of his mission. As the political expansion of Islam under the early caliphates laid the territorial foundations of a vast empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia. What gave Islam permanence and vitality in diverse lands was not only the authority of rulers but also the deep embedding of the religion into societies through networks of trade, intellectual life, cultural adaptation, and spiritual movements. And it was through these channels that Islam transcended its Arab origins to become a truly global civilization, shaping and being shaped by Africa, Asia, and Europe. Trade routes provided the arteries through which Islam's influence spread far beyond the reach of armies, for from the earliest centuries Muslim merchants sailed the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, traversed the trans-Saharan caravans, and connected the Mediterranean with sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and China. And in these exchanges, faith traveled with goods, ideas, and people, carried not by conquest but by the rhythms of commerce and human interaction, and the reputation of Muslim traders for honesty and fair dealing, rooted in the Prophet's own legacy as a merchant, often attracted local populations to adopt Islam, intertwining religious conversion with economic opportunity and cultural contact. In West Africa, the spread of Islam along trans-Saharan trade routes transformed societies from the 8th century onward as caravans carrying gold, salt, and slaves linked regions such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai with North Africa, where Berber and Arab merchants transmitted not only goods but also religious knowledge, Quranic texts, and Islamic practices, and rulers such as Mansa Musa of Mali in the 14th century embraced Islam, undertaking the Hajj to Mecca and sponsoring mosques and madrasas in Timbuktu and Gao, turning West Africa into a vibrant center of Islamic learning renowned across the Muslim world. In East Africa, the Swahili coast from Mogadishu to Kilwa became dotted with Muslim city-states by the 10th century, their prosperity tied to Indian Ocean trade with Arabia, India, and China. And here Islam blended with African languages and customs to create the Swahili culture, where mosques stood beside coral stone houses and Arabic script adorned local poetry, illustrating the adaptability of the faith as it took root among diverse peoples. In South and Southeast Asia, Islam arrived primarily through maritime trade, as Muslim merchants from Arabia, Persia, and later India frequented ports in Gujarat, Malabar, Sumatra, and Java. And over centuries, Islam became woven into the commercial and cultural life of these regions, eventually leading to the establishment of Muslim sultanates such as Malacca in the 15th century, where Islam became both a religion of rulers and a framework of trade diplomacy, linking Southeast Asia firmly into the wider Muslim world. Alongside trade, intellectual exchange played a crucial role in embedding Islam across continents. For the early Abbasid period fostered a golden age of scholarship centered in Baghdad, where translation movements brought Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Persian science into Arabic, and Muslim scholars synthesized and expanded this knowledge, producing advances in medicine, astronomy, geography, and law. And as this intellectual tradition spread to Andalusia, Cairo, Fez, Timbuktu, Bukhara, and Samarkand, Islam became not only a spiritual path, but also a civilizational force, respected by non-Muslims for its contributions to learning and culture. The madrasa system institutionalized education across the Islamic world, providing training in Quranic studies, law, grammar, and logic. And while initially tied to Sunni orthodoxy, these institutions also became centers where local scholars interpreted Islamic law and theology in light of their own social contexts, thereby creating localized expressions of the broader tradition that made Islam meaningful to diverse communities. A particularly powerful vehicle for the embedding of Islam was Sufism, the mystical dimension of the faith that emphasized direct experience of God through love, devotion, and spiritual discipline, and Sufi orders, or tariqas, such as the Qadiriyya, Naqshbandiyya, Chishtiya, and Shadiliyya, spread across vast regions, adapting to local cultures and offering accessible paths to Islam for people of varied backgrounds, for Sufi masters often traveled widely, establishing lodges, engaging in missionary activity, and providing spiritual guidance that complemented the formal structures of law and governance. And in many cases, Sufis acted as cultural mediators, translating the message of Islam into local idioms, incorporating indigenous music, poetry, and ritual into devotional practices, and thus creating bridges between Islamic universalism and regional particularities. In India, for example, the Chishti order emphasized love, service, and tolerance, attracting large numbers of Hindus to Islam, not through coercion, but through the charisma and compassion of Sufi saints, whose shrines became focal points of popular devotion. While in Central Asia, the Naqshbandiyya emphasized sobriety and adherence to Islamic law alongside mystical discipline, embedding Islam in Turkic societies as they transitioned from nomadic to settled life. Across Africa, Sufi brotherhoods such as the Tijaniyya and Muridiyya in later centuries would play central roles in both spreading Islam and organizing communal life, demonstrating the enduring importance of mystical networks in shaping Islamic identity across continents. Cultural adaptation was another key element, for as Islam encountered diverse peoples, it did not impose a uniform cultural template, but instead absorbed and reshaped local traditions within an Islamic framework, producing rich syntheses visible in art, architecture, literature, and everyday life. And thus in Andalusia, Islamic architecture fused with Roman and Visigothic influences to produce the iconic horseshoe arches and intricate stucco of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, while in Persia, pre-Islamic motifs found new expression in Islamic calligraphy and geometric patterns. And in West Africa, mud brick mosques, such as the one at Djenné, reflected both local building techniques and Islamic function. The Arabic language spread as the lingua franca of scholarship and religion, yet it often coexisted with vernacular languages, which absorbed Arabic vocabulary and script, so that Swahili, Urdu, Persian, Malay, and Turkish all developed as vehicles of Islamic expression, each producing distinctive literary traditions that enriched the diversity of the Muslim world. Poetry, in particular, became a favored medium of Islamic spirituality and culture, from the ghazals of Persian poets such as Rumi and Hafez to the qasidas of West African scholars. And these works not only articulated mystical longing, but also conveyed ethical teachings and cultural values that resonated widely. The embedding of Islam was thus not a top-down imposition, but a multi-layered process involving rulers who patronized mosques and schools, merchants who linked distant lands, scholars who preserved and transmitted knowledge, and mystics who spoke to the hearts of ordinary people. And through this dynamic interplay, Islam became at once universal and local, retaining its core beliefs and practices while adapting to the rhythms of diverse societies, creating a civilization that stretched across 3 continents, yet was internally plural and richly varied. The dawn of the modern age confronted Islam with forces of unprecedented scale and intensity, as European colonial expansion, technological revolutions, and global migrations reshaped societies across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, compelling Muslims to grapple with new political realities, cultural encounters, and intellectual challenges. And it was through this crucible of upheaval that Islam evolved into its contemporary global form, still rooted in its timeless principles, yet continually adapting to a changing world. The period of colonialism in the 18th and 19th centuries brought vast Muslim lands under the domination of European powers such as Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Russia, dismantling old empires like the Mughals in India and the Ottomans in the Middle East, and introducing new structures of governance, law, and education that profoundly disrupted traditional Islamic authority. In India, the British established their Raj after the decline of Mughal sovereignty, subordinating Muslim elites who had once patronized Islamic learning and institutions and replacing Islamic courts with colonial legal codes, thereby eroding the role of the ulema and transforming the administration of everyday life. While in North Africa, French conquest of Algeria beginning in 1830 and subsequent expansion into Tunisia and Morocco placed Muslim populations under foreign rule that sought not only political control but also cultural assimilation, sparking resistance movements led by figures such as Abd al-Qadir in Algeria, who combined military resistance with spiritual leadership rooted in Sufi networks, showing how Islam remained a rallying point for anti-colonial struggle. In Southeast Asia, Dutch domination of the Indonesian archipelago and British control of Malaya altered the economic and social fabric, yet Muslim sultanates and scholars continued to preserve religious institutions even as colonial authorities sought to harness Islam for their own purposes, demonstrating the complex interplay of accommodation and resistance. These experiences of colonization forced Muslims to rethink their place in the world, and a spectrum of responses emerged from outright resistance to reformist adaptation. Thinkers such as Jamal al-Din al-Afghani in the late 19th century called for pan-Islamic unity against European encroachment, urging Muslims to revive the spirit of ijtihad, independent reasoning rather than mere taqlid, imitation of past scholars, while his disciple Muhammad Abduh in Egypt advocated reconciling Islamic principles with modern science, rationality, and political reform, laying foundations for movements that would continue to shape Islamic thought into the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire, long the preeminent Muslim power, faced its own crisis in the modern age as European encroachment, internal decline, and nationalist uprisings weakened its authority, culminating in its dissolution after World War I and the abolition of the Caliphate by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1924, a seismic moment that forced Muslims to reimagine the political dimension of their faith in the absence of a central unifying authority, and this vacuum fueled both modernist and revivalist projects, from secular nationalism to the rise of groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, founded by Hassan al-Banna in Egypt in 1928, which sought to restore Islam as a comprehensive guide for society in response to Western dominance and secularization. Meanwhile, globalization in the 19th and 20th centuries, accelerated by steamships, railways, and telegraphs, connected Muslim societies more closely with one another and with the wider world, intensifying exchanges of ideas, goods, and people. And the annual pilgrimage of Hajj became increasingly a site of global Muslim encounter, as pilgrims from Africa, Asia, and beyond gathered in Mecca, not only fulfilling a religious duty but also carrying home new perspectives, books, and networks, reinforcing the sense of belonging to a worldwide ummah. The spread of print technology revolutionized Islamic communication, enabling newspapers, journals, and books to circulate reformist and revivalist ideas across borders, and later radio and television further amplified the reach of religious discourse. While in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, digital technology and the internet opened unprecedented avenues for Muslims to engage with one another across continents, transforming how knowledge is accessed, authority is claimed, and identities are negotiated. Migration played a central role in reshaping Islam in the modern global age, as millions of Muslims moved from their homelands to new regions, often as a result of colonial labor systems, economic opportunities, or political upheavals, and thus Islam took root in Europe, the Americas, and other parts of the world where it had previously been marginal. South Asian Muslims migrated to Britain during and after the colonial period, North African Muslims settled in France and Belgium, and Turkish workers moved to Germany during the post-war economic boom, creating diaspora communities that had to navigate the tension between maintaining Islamic traditions and integrating into secular Western societies, while in the United States, waves of Muslim immigrants from the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa joined with African American Muslims who had developed their own rich Islamic traditions through movements such as the Nation of Islam and later mainstream Sunni Islam, making the American Muslim community one of the most diverse in the world. These diasporas not only transformed the religious landscape of host countries, but also fed back into global Islam through remittances, transnational networks, and intellectual exchanges, reinforcing Islam's global character. Within Muslim-majority societies, the encounter with colonialism and globalization sparked diverse reform movements, some emphasizing a return to the fundamentals of Islam as a way to resist Western influence, others promoting reinterpretation and adaptation. In Arabia, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab in the 18th century had already launched a puritanical reform movement in alliance with the House of Saud, seeking to purify Islam of what he saw as innovations and deviations, and this movement, later supported by oil wealth in the 20th century, would exert global influence through funding mosques and schools worldwide. In South Asia, movements such as the Deobandis emphasized strict adherence to Islamic law and learning as a way to preserve Muslim identity under British rule, while the Aligarh movement, led by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, promoted modern education and cooperation with colonial authorities, reflecting the spectrum of strategies adopted by Muslims in the modern age. In the 20th century, Islamist movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami articulated visions of Islam as a comprehensive political system, seeking to establish states governed by Sharia, while others pursued more quietist or spiritual paths. And in recent decades, debates over democracy, human rights, gender equality, and pluralism have animated Muslim thinkers and activists seeking to reconcile Islamic principles with the demands of modern global society. The rise of nation-states after decolonization further complicated the picture, as Islam became intertwined with national identities in countries such as Pakistan, founded explicitly as a homeland for South Asian Muslims, and Saudi Arabia, which positioned itself as the guardian of the holy places and promoter of Islamic causes, while in other contexts, secular nationalism, as in Turkey under Ataturk or Tunisia under Bourguiba, sought to confine religion to the private sphere, often provoking backlash and revivalist responses. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 marked a dramatic assertion of Islam as a revolutionary ideology, inspiring movements across the Muslim world and altering global perceptions of Islam, while at the same time provoking intense debates among Muslims themselves about the proper relationship between religion and politics. Globalization also brought Muslims into closer contact with one another's diverse traditions, as migration and communication created spaces where South Asian, Arab, African, and Southeast Asian Muslims interacted more directly, leading to both tensions over interpretations and enriching cross-cultural fertilization of practices and ideas. And this global interconnectedness is reflected in contemporary Islamic scholarship, which circulates digitally, transcending national and sectarian boundaries. Technology in the 21st century has become a decisive factor in shaping Islam's global presence. For online platforms host Quranic study circles, fatwa services, sermons, and debates, accessible to millions, democratizing access to religious knowledge, but also challenging traditional hierarchies of authority as charismatic preachers and influencers reach audiences across continents without institutional backing, while social media enables Muslims to create communities of belonging, activism, and solidarity that transcend geography, yet also exposes them to polarization and contestation over authenticity, identity, and practice. Reform movements today address not only the legacy of colonialism and secularism, but also urgent contemporary issues such as climate change, economic inequality, gender justice, and interfaith relations, and Muslim thinkers and organizations increasingly situate Islamic ethics within these global conversations, arguing that Islam has resources to contribute to solving universal challenges while also preserving distinct values and traditions.